Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Okay. As we gather on this last day of our intensive training, let us first give thanks. Living in a state of gratitude is the gateway to grace. And I have the pleasure of introducing our next nursing giant and speaker. Dr. Margaret P. Moss is an enrolled member of the Mandan and Hidatsa and Arikara Nation, 3 affiliated tribes of North Dakota, and has equal lineage as Canadian Sioux. She is currently director of the First Nations House of Learning and a full professor in the School of Nursing. Dr. Moss is the first and only American Indian to hold both nursing and Juris Doctorates and published the first nursing textbook on American Indian health. Dr. Moss's clinical experience included being staff nurse and then house supervisor and patient education specialist with the U.S. Public Health Service, Indian Health Santa Fe Indian Hospital, and her areas of research include American Indian health, aging, health policy, and health disparities with a focus on social and structural determinants of health. Dr. Moss's research methods have included ethnography, geographical information, survey, and other qualitative methods. She has given over 150 presentations on these topics of note, most recently in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and across the US. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Moss.
Is this microphone on that I'm? Yeah. Okay, good. I never know. So thank you, Nia. That was wonderful, and I'm so happy to be here and to see you all. Thank you so much. Yes. So just to nod to my initials, I had no intention of getting all those initials. I was just a nurse minding my own business, but then I started working in the Indian Health Service hospitals and saw all the issues that were going on there. And my area was aging, so I was really interested in what the American Indian elders were doing. They would never allow themselves to be discharged from the hospital into long-term care because it was always, this is New Mexico, Anglo or Hispanic care, and they just didn't feel that they were understood. There was racism in border towns and the larger cities, so they would just rather go home to their reservations and so forth. So that became my question for my dissertation of why won't they seek care and do gerontological theories really match this population that nobody knows anything about? And the answer is they don't. So I thought, well, they need to then have their own nursing homes on the reservation where they take away the racism part, hopefully, and where they can conduct the things that they need to do. And yet they couldn't, because most states at this time, and I did this in 2000, finished the study in 2000, had moratoria on building more nursing home beds. So if you didn't have any now in your community, you couldn't have them. And they didn't. There were 306 reservations at the time, and 12 had nursing homes. So now they could never have nursing homes, and it's catch-22 because they're not going to go find the other ones. They can't have their own, and it just goes on and on. So I decided that I needed to know more about moratoria, state laws versus federal trust responsibility, which is what American Indians have with their nations, with the U.S. government. And so I went to law school. So I didn't go to be Clarence Darrow or anything. I just, I wanted to understand what the heck was going on. So that's how I got here. But now I really focus on federal Indian law because the federal government is the one that has the relationship with the nations, not states, not anybody else. And so I also learned that nurses, through no fault of their own, don't know any of that. I mean, they just don't teach it. They don't teach these barriers, these structural and political barriers to health for American Indians. You don't learn it in health professions, but also you didn't learn it K through 12. So I'm gonna hit some of that by design, American Indians were cut out of all, you don't see them on CNN, you don't see them in your books, you don't see them anywhere. And so then how could you possibly know how to take care of them? And, you know, many of us say, oh, we're culturally competent. Does anybody know anything about taking care of American Indians? And I'll tell you that they are in your patient populations. You just don't know it. So I'll get to that. But anyway, so I just wanted to explain why I have these. I didn't start out saying, oh, I'm gonna do this and that. I just kind of worked that way. So I don't have my walking around glasses, so let me put these ones on. See where or am I supposed to use this one? It's all a blur. Okay. So anyway, today I'm going to talk about recognizing the impact of past and present federal legislation and policies on the health and well-being of Indigenous communities. Describe the health disparities that are impacting American Indians, Alaska Natives. You know, unfortunately, we're winning the race of having the worst health, but nobody knows that. I go to, GSA, Gerontological Society of America, APHA. They have 3,000 to 5,000 papers given. I'd say 5 are American Indians. Most of them are students who talk to 3 people. We don't hit the charts. Nobody knows anything. We're never there. So I'll talk about that. And why nursing and other health professionals, especially mental health professionals, need to know and why they don't. And then demonstrate some best practices about that. This picture and the one that we started with is the Longhouse where I work. University of British Columbia has a huge Indigenous program. I'm over this facility and all the programming in it. There are about 1,600 Indigenous students on the Vancouver campus and maybe another 600 on the smaller campus they have about 300 miles away. And I've never seen that. I've worked in many universities in the US and there's nothing like that. Sometimes some universities I've been in, we're like, can we have a room? Can we have anything, for Indigenous students? They're like, there's no room. And so that's one of the attractions to University of British Columbia. They have this, they have a huge Indigenous academic library focused on cataloging systems that were Indigenous, not the Library of Congress and so forth. So they have a lot going on over there. So that was my attraction. Now, this is my reservation on Fort Berthold in North Dakota. Anybody? Nobody's been there. Anyway, it's in the middle of nowhere, Highway 2. I don't know. There's no reason to go there unless you were going there. But anyway, but I put it up there because this federal legislation I'm talking about hasn't just been in my professional life, but my personal life. And I'll talk a little bit about that coming up with some photos. So literally, there was a tagline, and it probably still exists in some circles, of trying to get rid of the Indian problem. That was an actual driving policy over the last 100, 150 years. We need to get rid of the Indian problem. In other words, get rid of them, get the land, and move on. That was the whole point of all of this. And all 3 branches of the government were in on this. So Supreme Court, and then the bottom part, and I'll go through those in a minute, is the legislative and executive branches. They came up with these policies and eras, and then the executive branch carried them out. Horrific, as you'll see soon. And this is our friend Andrew Jackson. You gotta love him, And anyway, so I know. So no, we don't. So, but you'd be surprised how many people don't even know who he is when I give these talks. And then I usually stop and do a pop quiz. Are you ready? Yeah. Okay. How many federally recognized tribes are in the U.S.?
Somebody just told us that. 13. No. total is there?
There's 574. Yeah. And I can't tell you, like I said, I'm sure it's more than 150 now. The talks I give across the U.S., no one ever knows. So don't feel bad. No one ever, and why? Because they didn't teach it to you. Once again, on purpose, they didn't teach this to you. These are actual nations within a nation. I look up FAAN Deloria, and they have a government-to-government relationship with the U.S. So there's 574. That's a lot, you know. And sometimes I get guesses of 3, and I'm like, well, I just introduced myself with 3 tribes. You think that's it? And then sometimes I get 1 million. I'm like, well, do you think every 3 of us is a tribe? You know, people just, they can't even conceive of what any of this is. And do you know how many state recognized tribes there are? Anybody? Is there anybody from North Carolina? That's where they mostly. There's 66. And then there's so many American Indians who aren't either in a federally recognized tribe or a state tribe because of some of these federal policies. I'll tell you, they got cut out, just summarily cut out. Or they tried to hit assimilation, termination. There's all these things going on that the average American has no earthly idea of what has been happening. And so I try to give that pop quiz because, you know, this is what you learned. I know because I grew up in the same systems you guys did. Turkey at Thanksgiving, right? And here's the Pilgrims and the Indians. And Christopher Columbus, 1492. Who never set foot in what is now the U.S. People don't even understand that he didn't discover America. Are you crazy? And yet that's what you learn. And if he had stepped foot over here, he would have been staring at 30 million indigenous people who'd been there for 15,000 years staring back at him. How is that discovering anything? But you don't, nobody learns that. You just learn, 1492, sailed the ocean blue and all that. So, no. So anyway, and it carries on to what I've learned in nursing school, because I've been in 3 programs, of course, my initial license, master's, PhD. And then I've taught in 4 universities. And this is what you learn if you learn anything. They don't look you in the eye. They want their hair back, or fingernails or whatever, if you should cut it. And that's about it. I mean, you really don't learn too much about. And that looking in the eye thing is very tribal specific. So for instance, in my tribe, an unmarried man shouldn't look certain females in the eye, or a son-in-law shouldn't look a mother-in-law in the eyes, or some of them are, children shouldn't look an elder in the eyes unless they're asked, and so forth. But it's not just this general, they don't look in the eyes. And then there's reasons, if I get into it, about the hair and all that stuff. But anyway, the point is you really don't learn too much about what they need. So. And then you always hear this. This happened 400 or 500 years ago, whatever the initial contact and so forth. Why can't they just get over it? And it's heard in other populations as well. And I fight with my husband about this. So just a little aside, my husband is black. He's from Detroit. He's 6'10". He used to be the center at Gonzaga like 100 years ago. So if anybody follows basketball. And my son, the youngest one, passed him. He's 7 feet tall now. So anyway, they can't hide. But anyway, and I've got 4 of them, and they all walk by me. Now, I am not sure. I have shrunk in my old age, but my kids walk by me in utter disdain going, God, you're so short. Anyway, so I have 4 Afro-Indigenous children, a black husband, so we all have heard all this, why can't you get over it? So one of the sayings that I particularly like and include in my writing is, invasion is a structure, it's not an event. That's why you can't get over it. Until you get rid of the structures, you can't get over it. It is not just 1492, one and done. It is structures. And so this is one of my favorite by Patrick Wolf. And so here's my couple of examples. I'm sure you recognize these people. So this is Mount Rushmore. I don't know if you know, but in Indian country, which is an actual legal term, these are known as the four horsemen of the American Indian apocalypse. Has anybody heard that one? Why is it, you ask? George Washington, he took the tenets of a constitution from the Iroquois, and then he took the bald eagle as the symbol from them, and then ordered the extermination of American Indians. Then we have your friend Jefferson, who was actually the architect of the trail. Here's our friend Andrew Jackson just carried it out. So, you know, Jefferson is so revered, but not in Indian country. And then Teddy, who was famously always saying, the only good Indian's a dead Indian, and we're not that sure about the last one. So I just took you from 1700 to 1900. This is our president. If this is what they think about American Indians, what do you think the general populace is thinking about American Indians? It's not good. And then Lincoln was the worst of all. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? I'll have more on that later. But I know that all people heard and knew about was the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, that's great. But 6 days before that, the most horrendous thing by his order occurred. And nobody knows that. But just telling you that right now. And this formation was already called the Six Grandfathers, and it was sacred land in Lakota country. And therefore, that's why it lent itself so well to doing this. Everybody's like, oh, that's brilliant. Hello, it was already the Six Grandfathers. And they completely blasted it and wrecked it and put these four horsemen up. And again, nobody knows that. So it's like, oh, everybody's looking. I mean, I've been there myself, but it's like, I mean, it is a big feat. But when you think about where it is and why it is, and they knew it was, and they did it anyway. That's why you will hear rumblings if you look at Indian country stuff about getting rid of that. Never gonna happen, but. And then when you think about it, the old why don't they get over it? Look what we have to look at every day to trade in America. Look, so if you have the most horrendous, evil people in your mind, and then to live in this country, you have to use this stuff. I'm sure most people don't even think about it. Horrendous for American Indians. So that's that thing about, it's a structure. These structures are all in place, and they're everywhere. These are just some little examples. And then, I like to say I am no spring chicken, but I'm not dead yet. This is how close we are to how we used to live. The little boy is my grandfather. The man is my great-grandfather. This is not some, we dressed up for some, this is them around 1905. And so it's not that far, 2 generations back, this is how we were living. And now, this is how, this is assimilated me, if you will. And did you know that we were the last people, we're the first people, I mean, we're even called First Nations, first people, all that, but the last ones to get citizenship. Everyone else got citizenship, except America. Who knows, has this stuff sound familiar? So blacks got it in 1880s, women 1990, 1920, and American Indians 1924. They could have some citizenship before that, but they had to promise to speak English, eschew their ways, become Christian, farm, etc. So I just showed you this picture. Do you think these people are citizens? No. They are not. And so this picture is my mother and my brother. My mother was the first one in my biological family to ever be a citizen. We've been here they give us scrolls at my tribe, kind of like on that one show where they show your generations back. I can see many, many generations back. And yet my mother's the first one to be a citizen. So when I started nursing and my focus was elders, often they weren't born as citizens. So then we wonder, well, why don't they listen to us? Why don't they come to us? They couldn't even be citizens on the land that they were on. So when I started 30 years ago, people in their 60s were not necessarily born as citizens. And so many didn't want to be a citizen. You know, it's that old saying, oh, I'm the government and I'm here to help. Okay, so a lot of people don't understand that, and complete voting not till late 50s and 60. In fact, there was just a snafu in 2020, I believe it was. Many tribes don't have addresses. So when I worked at the Indian Health Service and we give discharge papers for the community health nurse, you literally write things like, go down to the tree without the branch on the right and turn left at the community house and go down 4 houses. You know, that was the address. So then I think it was North Dakota passed some kind of a rule that unless you had a physical address, you couldn't vote. So still being cut out in 2020. And I don't know if anybody noticed that. They briefly talked about it a little on CNN or something. And so somebody helped them to quick get addresses, and I can't remember the organization, but anyway. So if you remember back to my one slide that talked about the 3 branches, one being the Supreme Court, there were 3 seminal American Indian laws or cases decided by the Supreme Court, and it's called the Marshall Trilogy. So that's Chief Justice Marshall. We're talking 1800s, early 1800s. These are still the seminal laws and the base of federal Indian law today. Today, how do you think people were thinking about Indians in 1820? It wasn't great, and this is still guiding laws today. I won't go through this, but if you look at the underlines, so we were sovereign nations. We used to have, and recognizing the US as a sovereign nation, used to have actual treaties because they were recognized as sovereign nations. Then this case said, you're partial sovereigns. So that took away a lot. And what does that mean? So we do have tribal schools, tribal governments, police, but we don't have armies, not to your knowledge, and we don't have, we don't do our own money, this kind of thing. So that's why it's partial sovereigns, which causes a whole lot of trouble. Then we were considered domestic dependent nations. So we aren't a state, we aren't on par anymore with the federal government, so we're in this other category. So basically we're wards of the state being the federal government. And then the last one is a federal trust responsibility was formed, which means there was supposed to be this government to government relationship, federal government to each of these federally recognized tribes. And mixed results there. As you can see, some of the tribes are the poorest people in the country. So that was the Supreme Court. Luckily, and I don't know how many people are aware, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but there's this thing called the Indian Child Welfare Act. It just went up to the Supreme Court, I don't know, in the last week or 2, and was decided to keep it. That's a good thing, and for once, and I can't believe it happened, but it's a good thing. But I'll talk about that again in a minute. And then probably it's good at this point, since we talked about federally recognized tribes, to say, who is an Indian? Have you gone over this? So in the eyes of the US, only members of a federally recognized tribes are American Indians in the eyes of the US, meaning they get BIA services, they can go to Indian Health Service. People say, oh, you get free health care. No. First of all, and I think it was Senator Inouye who said a while back, it's the first prepaid healthcare system by ceding millions and millions of acres of land with the promise of then being taken care of. So they ceded the millions and millions, and they didn't really get much back. So, but if you are a member of federally recognized tribes, you can go and get care, whatever care there is, which is another problem. It is routinely underfunded. It's the most underfunded. There, IHS likes to put up a chart, like, and even people who are getting reimbursements and whatnot from Medicare, Medicaid think they're getting gypped, and then it goes VA, and then it's federal prisoners care, and then it's Indian Health Service. They're the lowest of all the federal programs in per capita monies spent. Their care is based in treaties, which, along with the Constitution, is the highest law of the land. These other ones are just public laws. And yet nobody notices, there's no outcry, this is supposed to happen, you know, as long as the grass is green and the wind blows and all that. Nobody's paying any, it doesn't matter if it's an RN or a DN. Nobody funds it to the levels it's supposed to be, and yet they have the land. So anyway, these things are going on. So that's why there's some huge outcries out there around people who are claiming American Indian status to get what little crumbs that we do get. And so that's why you would see outcries on Indian country newspapers and magazines and whatnot, like about Elizabeth Warren, but you cannot, she's a lawyer. She knows there's two ways to be able to call yourself American Indian. One is to be a member of this federally recognized tribes. That's in the eyes of the US. In the eyes of the community, if a community takes you as their own and says, yes, I knew your grandmother and, you know, all this kind of stuff, even though you've lost through assimilation or something else, we recognize you. Now, that's not a legal thing, but those two things would allow you to check American Indian on different things. She had neither one, and she's not the only one. There's so many people that, you know, say, oh, I think my grandfather knew an Indian once, and they'll check American Indian. You know, no, there's a legal term for it, and then there's a community way of being able to identify. That's it. There's no, oh, there's lore in my family. No, that's not it. So anyway, just one of my pet peeves. So I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. These are those eras in the legislative and executive branch. And some people know about it, some don't. I gave a talk similar like this. I was at Yale for about 5 years. And there's this august group, I can't even remember what they're called, but it's like old doctors and whatnot. Anyway, I gave this talk and like, I never heard of that. This Trail of I don't believe that happened. I'm like, oh my God. But anyway, like, yes, it really happened. So the removal era was an actual policy era of the federal government. Signed by Andrew Jackson. Jefferson was the architect. 50,000 American Indians were removed, making 25 million acres available for mostly white settlers, and it was dubbed the Trail of Tears. And again, so many people died. I don't put that stat here, I don't think, but thousands of people died on this trip. They were just walked from the East Coast to Oklahoma. You know, can you imagine? And there's all these horror stories, like if a baby cried, the soldier would take it and go whap on the tree, and that would be the end of that. It just horrible rape, murder all along the way. Horrifying. And then this is what my son, the younger one, learned when I was at Yale. So he was at a high school, maybe, I don't know, a couple miles away. This is what he learned, I kid you not, about the Trail of Tears. So this is like 2013 or something. The kindly soldier took the Indian family to a better place to live. So if that's what you learn, first of all, you don't learn it at all, but if you do learn it, if that's what you're learning, like, well, what's the problem? Again, get over it, you know. It's horrifying, the things that people don't know. And then the reservation period was to separate Indians from the US citizens, read white, and it's important for nurses to know that this is what I was alluding to before, 78% of American Indians are off reservation. It became 50-50 at the 1990 census, and ever since there's been a sort of an outflow. 60% are urban-based. There are now anywhere estimates, because we don't have any good numbers, 5 to 10 million American Indians. So if 78% are off, I guarantee you there's American Indians in your populations. But nobody knows it. And I'll bring this up later, but they are the most misidentified group in America by 40%. There's been studies. And how are they identified for death rates and so forth? It's the ME or the funeral director going, white, Hispanic, they're just guessing. They have no information. If nobody's there and they just guess. So they're wrong 40% of the time. There's been studies, the next closest group are all around 4% off, white, black, Asian. They're mostly white. So we are misidentified. Nobody knows we exist. Nobody knows really what an Indian is. What you've seen on TV or in movies doesn't really represent, So, and so it's important for nurses. Why, you ask? Because if they are American Indians and members of federally recognized tribes, they do get Indian health services at no cost to them. So you would have to know to route them, or mental health workers, anyone in the health professions, route them to the Indian Health Service if they're nearby. Or they can get contract care. So if they're not nearby, they'd have to apply to their tribe to be taken care of from some city where they are. There's things to know. If they're state recognized tribal people, then those states, which are mostly in the South, have state programs like I'm familiar North Carolina does. You could route them there. And if they're neither, but they're ethnically American Indians because of displacement, you'd have to know to find other nonprofits or other places to send them. So you really have to know. And then even if somebody identified in your patient population, yes, I'm American Indian. Okay, you got that. Now what? Does anybody know what to do or how to take care of them or what questions to ask? You really don't learn it anywhere. So that's what spurred me on to make the textbooks. I encourage you. It's in most libraries. And then our friend Lincoln, who I said was the worst. Sorry, I have asthma. I'll cough if I don't. There's a thing called Dakota 38 or Dakota 38 plus 2. Who's heard of this? One. And I'm not surprised. So Lincoln ordered the largest mass execution to date on US soil as ordered by the government. Does anybody? It's the largest mass execution and nobody's heard of it. Ever. And it's not just you, it's everywhere I go. So he really wanted to kill 300, but he's like, what will the Europeans think? So he cut it down and he hung them in this made for 40 people gallows. These people were all Dakota from Minnesota. This happened in Mankato, Minnesota. And they had little to no trial. They mostly couldn't speak English. And they just hung them so they could get land to the white farmers in Minnesota. It's the most horrendous, horrific act. And nobody knows it. So anyway, I'll have a little bit more on that later. It was in 1862. Oh, and it happened 6 days before the Emancipation Proclamation. So everybody knows that, but nobody knows what happened to the Indians. The Indians know what happened to the Indians, but nobody else knows. And you don't hear it. On this date, does CNN go off, on and on about, you never hear it. Nothing. You don't hear it at all. But we know it, and that's why I say, here's Mount Rushmore, here's these people that did these horrendous things. You're forced to trade with the money, and there's a lot of this historical trauma with American Indians. And then this is another federal policy period, the allotment and assimilation era, dividing land up into allotments to hopefully get rid of them. Like you get smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. People are probably most familiar, if at all, about the assimilation side of this era. The land part was to break up Indian ownership and get rid of the land, and then hopefully, again, get rid of the Indian problem, tribal existence. They just want to get rid of us because we're a problem and a reminder. So they just want to get rid of. And then any surplus lands, quote unquote, were confiscated. There was a loss of 48 million acres, and the remaining land was in largely unfarmable, far off, bad weather situations. Whereas Jefferson had promised they could occupy these lands forever. So I just told you just briefly, 25 million acres lost over here with Trail of Tears, 48 million acres lost over here. My reservation, Fort Berthold, used to be 12 million acres. It's down to 1. They just kind of keep chipping away. Hopefully they get rid of it all and get rid of us, and they can move on. The assimilation part. Have you all heard of the boarding schools?
Yes.
Okay, good. This is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It's the first, most notorious. They have a whole site if you're interested on all sorts of stuff. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School, I think it's called. Thousands and thousands of children were just snatched from their homes and sent on trains to this school. There was a lot of schools all across the country, and they weren't really schools. They were more like prisons. And many children were lost, killed, raped. I don't know if you've seen the hubbub in Canada. It's all the same. We always say we didn't cross the border crossed us. It's all the same stuff. And they just have these new heat-seeking, or I don't know what it is, some way to see things underground. And they found thousands of American Indian children buried around mass graves around their boarding schools. So we started looking, and guess what? And when this story came out, maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, it surfaced some of the plans for these schools. Here's the education department, here's the dorms or whatever. Here's the graveyard. How many of you have sent your kids to a school that had a graveyard in the plans?
No.
And again, so these are the horrifying things that Indians know, have experienced, it's in their bloodlines. And so that's bad enough. But then to have nobody know it, it's never taught, it's never talked about, it's not on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, again, doesn't matter if you're R or D, nobody knows. And so to us, nobody cares. These horrific things have happened. And you can see and hear thousands of kids, and it went on for years. I think there were like 130 graduates, And so people would go back, and now they didn't know, because they were snatched sometimes at 5. They go back at 18, 20. They don't speak the language anymore. They don't know what's going on. They're outcast there. They're outcast here. And so, again, why can't they get over it? There's many reasons. Then I learned this in law school. I took federal Indian law. The pendulum swings back and forth. Well, early only swings back. This is the one time it swung forward a little, and you can see it was only for 6 years out of all the stuff I've been talking about since 1803. And so here, there was John Collier was the commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he tried to give back some holdings. He tried to help them figure out how do they want to govern themselves, come up with their own constitutions or whatever they want to call it, and then that was it. And now we're in the termination era, just that fast. So is anybody familiar with this? So what happened here was, as I told you, the federal government had a federal trust responsibility with American Indian tribes, which means they were supposed to give healthcare, education, take care of them. They took all these land. So instead, in the termination era, Congress voted to cut off 100 of them. We would have had almost 700 tribes. They're like, nope. And they just summarily cut them off. So I also learned this, and it's a little term of art or whatever you want to call it, that an Indian is only an Indian if Congress says you're an Indian. So that's actually a legal thing. Or you're only an Indian by the sufferance of Congress. Those are two terms of art. What they really mean is a tribe. Congress picks tribes and says whether you're a tribe, and then a tribe picks its own membership. But the shortcut is an Indian. What other population can be legislated in or out of their identity? Again, just horrific. So during this time, there was also a thing called relocation. So to me, I mean, I don't know, you guys might be doing Private Benjamin, you know, oh, sign up and you get a yacht and this and that. So here they said, oh, come to the cities. We've got apartments for you, beautiful homes. We've got jobs, there's healthcare. And so a lot of Indians moved. That's why you'll find a lot of them in Portland, Oregon, Chicago, New York, and so forth. So they get there and there's nothing. There was nothing. Either it was inadequate or there was nothing. And now they've moved. They have no money, they have no means, they have no way to get back. And so that's why we have urban populations right now. And did you know that New York City has the most? It has the most in a city. There's about 120,000 American Indians in New York City. And yet, there's not one Indian clinic, IHS hospital, there's nothing. If they were a tribe, they'd be like the 10th largest tribe, and there's nothing for them there. And people don't even know they're there. And it's the same in Chicago, Portland, Albuquerque, Seattle, all across where they say, oh, go to the cities. And this is why we have these tent things. I took this picture myself in Minnesota, Minneapolis. We have one of the biggest tent cities that there are for American Indians because there's just nowhere for them to go. And this is happening today. And I hear a lot, you know, in other cities of other unhoused and so forth, but you rarely hear about the very specific American Indian tent city crises. It's not just in Minneapolis, there are many places. So since they were cut off, again, loss of health care. This is again why nurses, any healthcare professionals need to know what's going on. So you need to know how to route them and how they're, what needs do they have? And then understand this entire thing I've been telling you are the roots of historical trauma. So again, we know this happened. That's horrible. But what makes it worse is no one else knows. And so then that's why you get that, why can't they get over it thing. Now, supposedly, though, we are in the best era, supposedly. It's called self-determination, and it started in the 1970s. So that was the Indian Education Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act. Oh, I forgot on the, where did it go? This one. American Indian children were adopted out and fostered at alarming rates in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to non-Indian families. And adoption to non-Indian families is now largely against federal Indian law. That's the Indian Child Welfare Act. And it was just up for consideration by the Supreme Court, and luckily they upheld it because children would, again, just as they were in boarding schools, leave, die, they couldn't cope, they get into alcohol and drugs, suicide, it wasn't working. And so they finally figured that out in 1978. Although today, I don't know why it's up again. People think it's just an adoption case if you're familiar with it at all, but what it heads to is sovereignty. Again, you can't go into somebody else's nation and take their children just because you want to. So if you got rid of that law, that means you got rid of sovereignty, which is going to just explode everything in Indian country. So luckily, I mean, there's a couple of people you might be able to guess who voted against it, but it passed. So here's another problem, is data distortion. So counting is off, and I alluded to that before. 40% misidentification is huge, and it's harmful because as bad as all our numbers are, they're much worse, probably by 40%. But people are not being identified correctly. There's a thing called Trends in Indian Health. Is anybody familiar? It is the publication put out by the US, PHS, IHS, Indian Health Service. They haven't made one since 2014. It's almost 10 years. That's the official publication of Indian Health Service. And should you go into it, I mean, the stuff's old now. And again, why isn't Congress or why isn't anybody going, hey, get that thing out? Nothing. But anyway, you'll note that there's all these asterisks. It's nothing but a bunch of tables. It's, the death rate of this, of that, it's tables mostly with a little bit of explanation. Almost every table is asterisk, 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 and it all says basically, well, these are state numbers and they're incorrect. They're not right, or we tried to fudge it or whatever. That asterisk appears like 130 times in this federal report. Nobody knows what the real numbers, and this happened again in COVID. As bad as COVID was, we were like the highest death rate, but it was actually worse because people, the ME's going, oh, it's an Indian or it's white or it's, whatever. And they were wrong most of the time. So our numbers are off, which is horrendous. Data is information, data is money, data is, moving things along, and our data is all wrong. Again, 78% are off reservation, so you are running into them, but nobody knows it. There's also the overcounting I talked about, because there's actual IHS numbers, meaning you are entitled to go to an Indian Health Service hospital. That's about 2 to 3 million people. You have to show your card. You have to prove you are an American Indian. And then there's the census, which is anywhere from 5 to 10, because you get the people, oh yeah, I'll check that box. And by those two definitions I just gave you, they're not. So there's overcounting and undercounting. And then life expectancy is the lowest, not just in Indian country, not just in the US, in the Western Hemisphere. And again, people are flying off to Haiti or wherever, which is fine, right over the dead bodies of American Indians in their own backyard, So when you look at the global numbers, let's say the census, maybe it's in the 70s, early 70s, everybody else is late 70s. No, it's much worse. Those are those, I think I'm an Indian. When you go to Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Alaska, anywhere, get deep into the reservations and so forth, it's 40s. People average life expectancy is 40s. On my tribe, a woman is 52, so I'm living on borrowed time right now. 52, 48 for men. That's the average life expectancy, meaning many of them are dying before that. My area is aging, and across most tribes, we hit 65 at 8%, which is almost half of the general population, which is 16, 17%. So we didn't even make it. So again, these are very important stats for healthcare workers of any stripe. Anyway, it's pretty bad. So, and here's some of the numbers. But again, I got it from Trends in Indian Health from 10 years ago. It's death rates. Alcohol is 520% greater. Tuberculosis, 450. Liver disease, 368. Motor vehicles, 207. In Indian country, we often say those motor vehicle crashes are often suicides, but they're counted as motor vehicle. Diabetes, 177%, but again, I think it's the Pima in California have the highest rate in the world. It's 10 times the rate of the next closest group. Poisoning, homicide, suicide. Suicide in the teenage cohort is triple suicides anywhere else. And they have a different graph. American Indians have a death graph or a suicide graph that's bimodal, that's non-Indians, bimodal. Teens will kill themselves and then older people will kill themselves. And then in Indian country, it starts in teens and goes to maybe 40 or 50 and come down, but it's a big wide mountain, and elders usually don't kill themselves because they're trying to get to the spirit world and do things right towards the end and all that. So there's different situations that people who care for American Indians need to know the differences. And then, not to be a downer, I'll get better, but the Genocide Convention at the UN came up with a definition in 1948, which I'll put the elements of that law here, or definition. And everything I just went through, you can exactly map the federal Indian policy periods on the definition of genocide. So I don't mince words anymore. It was genocide. Genocide on American Indians. The only population to have genocide. Oh yeah, this is when I started to tell you when me and my husband have our little maudlin conversations. I'm like, well, they didn't try to kill you, en masse, maybe one by one for whatever reason, but they want to keep you alive to work on the land that they stole from us. So they needed to kill us so you could work on the land. So anyway, although horrible things have happened in many of the populations, we're the only ones that have genocide as the literal process, or whatever you want to call it, that the federal government did. So, killing of members of the group, George Washington, Lincoln, Indian Wars, all sorts of stuff. Serious bodily harm, think about those kids that have been horribly raped, killed, sick, and uncared for. As well as just moving people to reservations. Like I said, it's unfarmable. It's, North Dakota where I am, minus 40 in the winter, and 110 in the summer because it's not near any tempering by coasts and so forth. Our particular reservation was actually at first doing pretty good because we're on the Missouri River. And so there was all this river stuff, vegetation, fish, etc. There was a school, there was a hospital, there was all sorts, people were living life. But the white farmers kept getting their lands flooded, their farmlands by the Missouri. So then our chairman, which is what we call like our chief, there's a picture I usually have, but I don't have it, is crying and forced to sign this thing with the government saying, you agree to put up a dam, and it flooded the whole reservation. So then all that stuff is now under what's called Lake Sacagawea. It's a fake lake, and they had to move up where there's nothing. And so somebody did a study and could draw exact line with evidence from that flooding to some of the highest diabetes rates in this crowd that didn't have it before the flooding. So things like this, again, are just constantly going on. I mean, I'm just one tribe of 570. There's stories like this everywhere, but again, nobody ever hears them. And then, again, deliberately inflicting conditions of life. Well, I just told you one. This place was flooded. Through 1976 or so, the Indian Health Service was sterilizing Indian women who did come for care without consent, or coercion. One tribe, I can't remember the name of it, was literally wiped out because it was a small one and they got to all the women. This is genocide. And then, as I said, forcibly transferring children, foster care, boarding schools, adoption. You can literally map termination, assimilation, reservation, relocation onto the definition of genocide. It was genocide. Some people try to say, or when they temper it, if they talk about it at all, they say cultural genocide. No, it's genocide. People need to get over it and understand that. I won't talk a lot about this, but this is the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, also a huge problem in Indian country. They are killed in reservation areas 10 times the rate of the next closest group. Murdered 10 times the rate of the next closest group on reservations. Were people aware of this? It was a Department of Justice study. And that's because of what I told you way back when about the Marshall Trilogy. There are still laws in effect on reservations today. Like if a non-Indian goes into Indian country and does God knows what, then they can leave and do this and that. You know, no, there's no consequences. You're not going to get caught. If you do get caught, you're probably not going to get prosecuted. And if you are and found guilty, tribes can only keep people for 1 day less than 1 year. So you could murder somebody and you're going to get 1 year. It's horrendous. And then, so my reservation, Fort Berthold in North Dakota, is about the size between Connecticut and Delaware. So it's the size of a small state. And there are 19 tribal police. And they're not all on at the same time. Let's say 5 are on at any given. You're gonna police Delaware with 5 people. So it's known as open season on American Indian women out there in the border towns and the cities that are out in the west. This is mostly happening in the west of the Mississippi. You know you can go on there and do God knows what. You're never gonna get caught or prosecuted or held. And they do. That's why the rate is so high. And again, my Facebook feed and my Twitter feed, because you get like Indian Twitter. But anyway, constant, I'd say every other day, this person's missing, this person's missing, this person's missing. And again, it never hits any of the major news outlets. This is constantly going on, and nobody knows. So I just want to point out, again, all this historical trauma, which I told you before, is hitting this contemporaneous trauma I just told you, highest murder rates, suicide rates, motor vehicle accidents, because again, we're out there in the middle of nowhere and you have to get somewhere if it's not suicide itself. All that's hitting, and nobody is helping to change the structure. So nothing's changing. When I became a nurse 34 years ago, all the problems, they're still the same problems 34 years later. Same stuff. I was going to tell you about this program about trauma rocks. I don't know if maybe I can briefly. It's something that a northern group in New Mexico came up with. Again, with the why can't you get over it thing. So they line up 7 like chairs with women in it, older to younger. And 7 generations is a big thing in our cultures. You're supposed to, what I do right now, I should think how's this going to affect generations 7 generations out. So the first woman, stuff happened to her, let's say in 18, whatever. She's got a little pile of rocks. Then she hands it to the next one because they have the historical trauma and then the stuff happening to them. And by the time you get to the people today, they literally have the rock, they have it all. And yet people are saying, why don't you get over it? Because I have all these, help me get rid of these rocks. But again, it's very little that's known, so it's hard. So speaking of the 7 generations, that gallows I told you about where Lincoln did his thing is roughly 7 generations back, depending on how you count a generation. And again, I'm from Minneapolis, and so There's a place there in the Twin Cities, the Walker Art Museum. They contracted with a white artist to build a replica of this thing, supposedly for education. And yet, they didn't consult with any elders, any tribes there, the Dakota people themselves, which is what this was against. They didn't understand or think about re-traumatization, which was huge. So at the time I was still in the East, but my daughter was at our house. I said, quick, I hear things. You only hear it on Facebook, you know. I said, go over there and see what's what. So she took all these pictures and little films and whatever and put, this is what it was. And so if you don't think re-traumatization, this stuff is still very close to people, this is what she found when she went there, and then I'll tell you a little bit about it. See if I can figure this thing out. This is like 2.5 minutes. Did anybody hear about this? I mean, here's a huge gallows. You could see that people instantly, so when I tell you it's right here in natives, right here, they went right out and did that. And yet, again, my favorite, I quick went on their sites and on TV, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, nothing. In fact, I used to have a screenshot where it says, no story here, or something to that effect. And yet, and again, it's because we're just so hidden, it's not considered news, nobody cares, nobody wants to think about it. In this same week, you might recall, the African American Museum just went up. And somebody had either like hung a noose or did a swastika, something like that, and it was everywhere. And then the same week, somebody did the same thing. I can never remember if it was a noose or, you know, the N-word, something on Michael Jordan's garage. That happened in the same week as this. Those two things were everywhere. Not that they shouldn't be, but I'm just making a point that here's 40 nooses and nothing. It's like no story here. It's completely hidden, and that you can see how American Indians were affected. Just immediately, they know it. I don't know if anybody else could have gone out there and said, oh, in 1862, and you know, here's their names, and no. So I'm almost done. So the takeaway, if I give you takeaways, And sometimes we use allyship. Sometimes, what's this next one? Accomplice. People are starting to say accomplice, at least in Canada. Although, I don't know, in law, it's a little, to me, it's like, is it really accomplice? But anyway, so you need to grow an understanding. It's for anybody. You probably have American Indians in your population somewhere, and you just don't know it. They're everywhere now. Grow an understanding of these experiences, because this is just under the surface for everybody. Understand to decolonize in your systems is to make room for those things that have already been excluded. And note that change has to be made. It's not just, oh, it'll be a nice thing. No, you have to take steps, make changes. And making room may start with evaluating your environment. Learn something new. Learn anything. Nobody knows anything. So anything you do will move your own needle because, and again, I tell even my students, it's by design you don't know, but now you know. So, try to investigate a little more. So I did put a little part about what have I been doing, because I noticed you had a bunch of, leading and so forth with your objectives. So I did, when I was at Yale, some acquisition editors came there or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, I have a book I'd like to do, a nursing book, a nursing text on American Indian health. They're like, oh, surely that's out there. I'm like, no, trust me, it isn't. Oh, yes, it is. It's out there. I'm like, I've been in 3 programs in 3 different states. I've taught in 4 other, trust me, there's nothing. So he called me back about 4 weeks later and goes, you're right, there's nothing out there. So here it is. It took to 2015 to get a nursing textbook on American Indian health. And it's done by regions, because an American Indian isn't an American Indian isn't an American Indian. They are completely different regions, historical backgrounds, geographies, and so forth. So I made sure that my contributors, who were mostly American Indian PhD nurses, and to me, they were the first ones. So I was only the 13th American Indian to get a PhD in nursing. So the ones before me are largely in this book. And yeah. So I don't know who would have been championing this before, because there weren't many faculty or anything. So anyway, I highly encourage you to take a look at it. And then I did another one in 2020, just on health equity itself. Also have some American Indian things in there. In British Columbia, the Minister of Health authorized an investigation on anti-Indigenous racism. I find that it's almost worse in Canada. They're doing so many things better, but their treatment is worse by the public. The government is saying, do this, but the general public. And I think it's because Canada is a very small nation. There's only 35 million people there. So that's like Texas and Arizona. But the percentage of Indigenous people is much higher than it is here. So you run into more, and when you run into people more, then you build the prejudices and so forth. So the anti-Indigenous racism is really bad there. So we did this investigation report. If you have any interest, there's a lot of quotes and things there, and it's specifically in healthcare, anti-Indigenous racism in healthcare. And then at the University of British Columbia, we launched Indigenous strategic plan for the university. Very few of these are in North America. This is the only one based in human rights, the murdered and missing, and the truth and reconciliation. So, what to learn more about? These are some of the buzzwords that come up a lot, especially in Canada, starting to hit America. So decolonization, as I alluded to, is make room in your programs, in your health systems, whatever, for some Indigenous thought, Indigenous ways. They're going to know how to take care of people. But right now, in most nursing programs, we don't have one more, credit to spare. Well, in Canada, they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they mandated you will in healthcare teach. So I teach one of the only mandatory courses on Indigenous people's health at that university. So decolonization is making room. It's a 2 credit, at least we got 2 credit. And then indigenization is getting that thought and knowledge and evidence in there. And then reconciliation is trying to get people on even footing. What we use there as a metaphor is we have this large reconciliation totem pole on the campus. It has 2 boats way at the top. And it's like we're pulling in the same direction, optimize health, but we have different ways of doing it, you know. So people should recognize both. Right now it's just the one boat. And then we're at question A. These are the 4 medicines: cedar, sweetgrass, tobacco, and sage that are pretty universal around most places. So I'll end there.
In the spirit of, can you hear me? No, it's okay. Thank you. In the spirit of gratitude and veneration, that's how we started off, right? We give you thanks. And there's a Santee Sioux tribe quote, I don't know if you're familiar with this, that says, "We will be forever known by the tracks that we leave." And on behalf of the SAMHSA MFP ANA Fellowship, we thank you for leaving an imprint today with us. Your presentation was impactful, but most importantly, informative. It was informative. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate
And
it.
we will now open the floor for questions and answers.
I'm not saying I have any answers, but.
Okay, I'll start here.
Elizabeth Files.
Elizabeth Files, thank you so much for your talk. I want to ask you, where do we go to recruit nurses to help you?
Yeah, and that's a toughie. And she wants to know, where do you get nurses to help? Do you mean Indigenous nurses or just any? Okay. So actually, in that book, the last 2 chapters are policy driven, and I talk a little bit about why there aren't more American Indian nurses. First of all, we're a small population, but even within that, all the things that I just told you about are crushing. So it's very hard. As we all know, nursing is one of the most difficult bachelors. There's some article about that because all the didactic, lab, clinical, et cetera, that it's very difficult. So I often tell this story. Again, when I was in Connecticut, I got to know very well the chief of the Mohegans. She was a nurse with a master's degree, and I actually recruited her into our DMP program there. She was in the first one. And she's now actually the U.S. Treasurer. So you have an American Indian signing all your money right now. I need her to get rid of the Andrew, but anyway.
Yes, me too.
Yeah.
And then moved to Tennessee, get rid of me.
Yes. So she told me this story. So she was at a chief meeting somewhere in the middle of the country. And so she's up on a dais like this, and there's tables like that, and I guess people were told to break out into something or whatever. So she had some tweens, 11 to 14-year-old girls sitting at a table by her, and she could hear them talking, and they go, "Well, when I get raped," I mean, if that's because they get raped like 4 or 5 times, any other group, along with the murdered and missing and so the sexual assault's even higher, taking away the definition of rape. If that's what you're thinking about every day, how am I going to keep safe? Who can I be near? Who's going to help me? Are you really worried about the Pythagorean theorem or, the nucleus or, No, you're just trying to get from point A to point B without getting missing, murdered, or raped. Mm-hmm. They know it's not if, it's when. And so I write a little bit about that. in the book. And even if you do get somewhere, people don't know what to do with you. My whole life, what are you, you know? and you know, but you know you have all this stuff, but you can't just blurt it, you know, do an hour-long dissertation to people about my problems, you know? So they know people don't understand them. They can't spend a lot of time on it. A lot of their energy is just trying to get from the next day. And then the programming, the tribal schools that are out there are not usually competitive. So there's a whole lot of reasons. And you know, in North Dakota, I was a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Fellow in the Obamacare years. And they were putting together, at that time, Future of Nursing. And I remember going to some, they had something at Union Station, I don't know, some talk about what they were doing. And they're like, you know, we really need to get rid of ADN, not get rid of ADN, but people should all be BSN and all that, which sounds good in theory. But in Indian country, all the schools are tribal colleges and they're mostly 2-year colleges. And so now are you going to cut out them? Because they're never going to make the leap to the big universities from where they're at. Even if they're not on the reservation, even if they're rural, even if they're urban, they're not going to make that leap. So we really have to think about that. And they literally pointed out North Dakota and said, look, it's at the time, and it might have changed, but at the time, the only state that says you must be a BSN to be an RN licensed in our state. And they're like, oh, they're so progressive, blah, blah, blah. And I knew in my head, no, they're cutting out the tribal colleges because it's a very prejudiced state against American Indians. So they don't get it. And so for 2 reasons, that cuts out them and it cuts out a lot of, you know, urban college, you know, community college people going and so forth. So we really have to look at those things, but those are some of the things that feed into it.
Hi, my name is Brianna Singleton, and I'm from California. And I have a quick comment. I deeply appreciate your presentation. Of all the things, it was the image of the gallows. And one of the things that you said, like, oh, I don't know what the word is, you know, are we accomplices or allies? I'm in San Francisco. I hear those things all the time. It annoys me. But when I heard you say it, what came to mind, it's we are comrades against white supremacy. Because when I see the images of what you call gallows, I see lynching trees of my people. And we are both fighting the same thing. And so I just really appreciate, especially when it comes down to history. And I think oftentimes when we talk about these things, about like racism, often what's missing is the historical aspect and how much of that is lost because how much of our people were lost along the way. And so I deeply appreciate your presentation. And so my question is for you, is because I come from California, and I know sometimes people argue for the sake of arguing, but I think a lot of people have this really genuine sentiment, is that First Nation, Indigenous, Indian people are doing okay because they have the casinos. Oh. And in my head, I'm like, I'm gonna fight you for the sake of fighting because I know that's wrong. But I don't think that I'm really educated of like what would be good talking points to share with people, because I do think a lot of people just generally think that things are going well, and other than saying like, no, there's a lot of other bad things, they say, well, at least they have the casinos. And I really don't know how to, like, what a good way to approach that conversation that's accurate and genuine.
Sure, and you know, I have a lot of them, but yeah, you're right. It's not great. And I do hear comments like that, oh, we have the casinos. Oh, well, you get checks. Well, where are they? I don't, you know, what? You get checks, you get this free and that free. And like, we are the poor. But anyway, there are about 5 really good casinos that are generating a lot of money. Most of them are in the east. So there's Foxwoods and Mohegan Sun in Connecticut. They're huge. In fact, Foxwood is the biggest in the world, not just in the US or Indian country. There's the one in Minnesota. You'd think I could think of it right now, but what is it? Mystic Lake? Anyway, it's connected with the Mall of America. There's constant buses, so they're doing really, every man, woman, and child in that tribe gets $1 million every year, and they have for quite a long time. but there's only like 500 of them. It's a very small tribe. And then there's a couple others that are doing fairly well. However, many tribes have these things, and sometimes, like, go to mine. On mine, it's practically a Quonset hut, and all it's doing is taking money from the people there. Because, like I said, who's going there? Who's going to Fort Berthold for any reason? So again, it's almost just another addiction. It's sucking money out of the people that live there. Most of them aren't doing great, and it's not doing anything for the people that are there. So no, people are not making money. There's a select few. Again, there's 306-ish reservations, because some are like mine. There's 3 tribes on one. And so on reservations is where you can have casinos, and there's probably 5 that are doing good. But these other ones have them, but they are just another addiction, unfortunately. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Tina Ohuche. I just graduated from the UNC DNP program, and I've been working for a couple of years now for an organization that I'm from North Carolina, so I work in North Carolina. And I've been working for this organization, and most of my patients are from rural North Carolina. They don't have no jobs, accommodation, food, or even pay their insurance. They don't have insurance. So I see a couple of my patients are American Indians. So my question is, because I heard you mention about resources that are out there for them. So in order to to direct them to the place where they can get the needed resources, because the resources are limited. So if I'm attending to Caucasians, Hispanics, Blacks, and the American Indians to the limited resources, it will be much better if I can direct them to resources meant for them so they can get the help they need, because the problem is huge within the area. Mm-hmm. So what would you advise?
If they are American Indians in the definition, like, you could ask them, are you an enrolled member of a tribe, federally recognized tribe? If they are, they can go to where I'm not that familiar with the Southeast, but if there's a Indian Health Service hospital there, if there isn't, there's probably clinics. And if they are state recognized, I know North Carolina has a whole program for American Indians who are state recognized, because there's like 8 of them. There are 8 state recognized tribes, and one, I think, the Lumbee, or the federally recognized. I'm not sure if they have the services, but you can find services around it. So you're in the eastern headquarters area, which is Nashville, I think. So I would look on the Indian Health Service site for your state and see if there are clinics or anything like that. But also, if they are a member of a federally recognized tribe, even if there isn't a local direct service, those are mostly in the West, where there's actual hospitals that they can go to. Then there's the indirect care, where they could get care it just has to be approved by their tribe and go to a private hospital.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, greetings. Eugenia here. So I am indigenous from Central America, more specifically Panama. And I work very closely with other indigenous nurses here in the United States. And one thing that I have seen, obviously, that we have the same traumas across globally. But one thing that I see that we have not done a very good job at is bringing those different indigenous groups here in the United States together. For example, in South Florida, I work very closely with Mayans, different Central American tribes that are, enclave groups, and definitely throughout the United States. But I do not see where there are large voices coming together. There's power in numbers. If we have similar history, we should be working more aligned with each other, not only globally, which I see very often. I have traveled to Australia, As well with the MFP program, I work very closely with John Lowe, who is my dissertation chair, has been my best friend for I wouldn't say how many years, but a long time. Jada from the Lumbee. So again, together, but I have not seen an initiative that bring other indigenous groups with more American Native here working together to have a larger voice. Do you see anything planned, anything that has happened before, maybe that I'm not knowing about? But I do think that the different indigenous voices need to come together in line and work together in different policy or even conversations.
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea, and I don't know of any, and it's mainly because both my work in Canada and US, it's specific laws in these two countries at least driving what they can do and who they cover. So the federal trust responsibility is only for these particular tribes. So if they want to get Congress to get more money for these things and so forth, it's very specific, even though we recognize, especially the 4 settler states, which is US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, but also recognize our counterparts in Central and South America. But I think it's because if people are trying to work on getting some of these things done, they have to work within that system. I see that also in Canada because it's different. But for larger policy initiatives and so forth, like they have at the UN, the UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I would love to see it if there was nursing or health professions get together around those sorts of things. I'm not familiar, I don't think there is any group like that now. So that's your charge. It's a start one. Yeah, no, I think that's great for the larger conversation. The problem is when people are trying to get something specific done, they have to work within their system.
I definitely agree because I too have indigenous lineage, being Guyanese and Arawakan Indian. And it wasn't until I went to the conference down in Austin, Texas, that I was able, through this fellowship program, to link up with people that look like me and share some of the same historical trauma. And so I think that is a great idea. I have a question about your ethnographical pieces. You and I talked prior, and I told you ethnography is definitely close to my heart.
Mm-hmm.
Could you maybe talk about or highlight one of your ethnographical pieces and or work that you are most proud of?
Sure. So my dissertation was an ethnography on the Zuni Pueblo in New Mexico, and I picked it because they're one of the most traditional tribes in the U.S. They still speak their language. They're not Christianized. They do their doings verbatim, step by step, and everything as they have for hundreds of years. And the reason for that is, the Spaniards came in from the south. And so in New Mexico, is anybody familiar with New Mexico? Okay. So there's, I believe, 23 tribes there. They're mostly Pueblos. There's some Apaches, a little bit of Navajo coming over. But because the Spaniards came through in the 1500s, all these Pueblos are called Santa Ana, Santa Domingo, San Felipe, San this, San that. They all have names like Calabasas and Vigil and this kind of thing, except the Zuni. The Zuni are the Zuni because they had a flat mesa, this corn mountain, they call it, Sacred Corn Mountain. There's like one way up and one way. They went up there and they waited for the Spaniards to leave and they came back down. So everybody else is Catholic, Spanish last names, Spanish tribal names, but they weren't. So I thought if I hit one of the most traditional tribes and I was trained pretty Western, everybody's going to fall on that continuum somewhere. So I did do an ethnography. Again, it was about why won't they see, they're desperate. You say, how are you, ma'am, grandma? And, she's got a dialysis bag, one eye and a half a leg. Oh, I'm fine. They would not go anywhere. They would not accept anybody else's care. So that became my question. And it's because, and I usually throw stuff about this in, but I didn't, the medicine wheel, where there's the 4 domains of the person, and 3 of them are not physical. So physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental. They're more worried about that. So I often say nurses are very close to indigenous thought in that way, because we're supposed to be thinking mind, body, spirit, and all that. It's supposed to be close. At least it's in the background somewhere. So of all the health professions, we're probably the closest to that sort of thought. But nurses still are physical first, maybe mental after that, maybe get to spiritual, but not that often. And but the elders I work with were spiritual first. That's what they cared about. If I have half a leg, oh well, I just need to get to the other side. So they worried about their spiritual activities. So during my investigation, I found out this particular tribe, there are so many must-do activities, and it's must-do. They have to do it, or else. It's not like Catholicism, you did something and then you go to confession and whatever. No, you have to do it right, and you have to do, or you bring death on yourself, your family, the pueblo, maybe even the world. So they have to do these things. So some of their must-do activities, especially the men, but also the women, but the men had some special categories, is they have to go outside every morning when the ancestors are out, so before dawn. They have to sprinkle cornmeal like holy water, like every day. They have to, and it has to be made in a certain way by certain people and certain prayers and so forth. There's a time during, I was there over Christmas, it's called Deshqui, that's their thing. And when they're in that, they can't do anything of the white world. So you could go right by Zuni and don't know what's there. There's not a light, there's not an engine running there. You can't change money, nothing. It's for 4 to 10 days. And then on the lunar months, men have to fast. And when it's called for with the high priest, you have to go outside, touch the actual earth, can't be on carpet and tile all day, if not sit or lie on the earth. Anyway, they have these whole, and then when they eat, they'll take a part of they have their plate, they'll take part of their food, however much they want to give to the ancestors and gods and so forth, and then they burn it. They either burn it or they have to give it to the high priest to take to the river. Anyway, it's a whole thing. So you take that person and you try to put them in a nursing home. They try to go out at dawn, the doors are alarmed and locked. They try to go out later and touch the ground. They're wandering, confused. Why are they out there? They try to burn their food, the sprinklers. They try to, everything that they have to do, they cannot do in a state-regulated and licensed nursing home. They're one of the people also that you raise the windows so the spirits can come and go. They're all hermetically sealed, and it just goes on and on. Everything they must do, they cannot do. So they literally rather die physically than not to be able to do those things. So anyway, that's when I said, they need a nursing home on their own thing so they can do those things, have an oven right in there. They're called kiva ovens, and burn their food, and have a dirt floor over in this section or whatever. And then we find out, no more nursing homes will be licensed. So it's a whole thing.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, my name is Nia Josiah Smith, and I'm from Oregon, and I just finished my DMP program. And one of the reasons I wanted to further my education was because of some of the structural issues that you're highlighting, specifically education. And one of my patients is part native, and she was really struggling with a lot of things: anxiety, depression. Her partner had committed suicide, and we're in the middle of COVID, so she's not focused on school. So when I see her for her annual checkup, she hadn't graduated, and she was only 1.5 credits short of graduating. And to me, that's just egregious, because the cycle then continues, right?
Yeah.
But I guess one of the things that really struck me just as Dr. Eugenia was saying, is that there's trauma in a lot of different groups here in the United States. And the phrase that keeps coming to me is hurt people hurt people. And I just, one of the things that has been on my heart this year in particular is generational healing. Because I see it in my own family, and there's a huge need. My immediate family, my extended family, we don't even realize the things that we're passing along.
Right.
But in terms of partnering, as a clinician, I'm very naive in this area, very ignorant in this area, but I do have patients who are Native, and I do want to honor them, but I also don't want to overstep something. Like, I don't know actually how to partner with them is what I'm trying to say. And I don't know, do they want to partner? So I guess I'm just wondering, are we at a point, do you think that we're at a point where we can partner in the way that could be healing for both of us? And if so, how do we do that?
Oh, I think so. And many people are afraid to ask somebody about their identity. So I know I almost did like a phenomenology of one and me over the years. I've had 4 kids, I've been in and out of hospitals or whatever. No one ever asked me. They have those things, and that's part of that misidentity. Nobody ever asked me. So they're just guessing, leave it blank, whatever it is. I'm sure they never thought, they never put it, especially in the East. I've spent a lot of time, and I grew up in the East, actually in this area. Nobody thinks of an Indian, so it's like, oh, what are you, Italian? Or, so, but they don't ask. People are afraid to ask. So I always tell all my nursing students, that's the first thing, you can't have truth and reconciliation without the truth part. So ask and say, how would you like to identify? I would leave it that open. I wouldn't even say, oh, are you Indian or whatever, because maybe you'll get all sorts of surprises. Oh, I identify like this, this, and this. Maybe there's intersectionalities, whatever, but people are just afraid to ask these days. I ask, how do you identify? They could tell you to go pound sand. I'm not identifying at all. Or they could tell you, oh, I'm an American Indian and blah, 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 and I need to smudge. Is there an area to smudge in this school, in this hospital, whatever? And I always say ask. So if you come with humility and respect, nobody's going to shoot you down. And if they are, that's, again, hurt people, that's their problem. But you're giving them the opportunity. Is there, oh, you are American Indian. Is there anything I need to know to help you? Or is there someone else I should talk to? Because I've learned this over the years. In Minneapolis, oddly enough, you don't think it's all, Scandinavians and whatnot, but they have the largest amount of Somalians outside of Somalia, and they have the largest amount of Hmong outside of Southeast Asia. So you have people from the desert and these rainforests in the coldest place on earth. But for whatever reason, I think there were some immigration portals or something. So I ask, I have no earthly idea, and you can't know every, I think there's like 57 languages in the St. Paul and Minneapolis public school system represented or something. And after you ask, I've noticed it's important, who can I talk to? So that's another thing I learned in the Southwest tribes. It's the paternal aunt who makes all the decisions. And in law, that they wouldn't even hit it yet. You have to go by these legal kinship things by the states. If you're a kid, it's your parents and grandparents and this and that. No, for their culture, it's the paternal aunt who makes all the decisions. And that's because the parents, they recognize, are focused on this. They're just supposed to give love and support and not worry about things. And so someone else is making those decisions. And that's how it's been forever. When I was in Minneapolis, for the Hmong, you have to talk to the eldest son, this kind of thing. So they're not running the usual legal kinship lines. So those are the things I ask. Is there anything you need because of that? And is there anybody I need to be talking to? And that kind of thing. So.
I have one last question. And this is more in the personal spectrum. And I always tell everybody, let's use our networks to really have safe and brave conversations, right? So for myself, obviously identify with multiple groups, Indigenous, Afro-Latina, And like you said, people kind of judge you by the way you look. So having, biracial children, what is the conversation you're having as a self-identity, right? Because to me, also knowing and owning your space is also a way to build resilience. And then pass it on. Like for me, my grandson is in Panama right now because to me it's very important for him to identify who he is and his culture, and learn from the land that his ancestors came from. And my husband is from Mississippi, so it's totally two different cultures. But I want him to know both very well, because to me, if you know where you came from, nobody else could tell you and create your space, right? So personally, how do what do you see about building resilience from knowing your own history, and make sure that our own next generation are also very well grounded in that to build resilience?
Well, first of all, they do, my 4 kids run the gamut of looks. So some look more black, some look in between, some look native and so forth. And so that's why you can't, because sometimes I put their pictures up and go, which one is Indian? And they all are. So my boys, they're like 6'5" and 7. They identify a lot with the black side, although both of them, although worked in Indian Health Service here in the central office here in Rockville, did little stints there. But I think they identify more in the black, but they understand. And then I have one daughter who followed in my footsteps, sort of, and she went to, it's called Fort Lewis. Used to be an actual fort in Colorado, then one of those boarding schools, and now they made it a college that has free tuition to give back, for Indigenous people. So she did her bachelor's in Indigenous People Studies and Native Studies, I don't know how to long name. And then she went to the University of Oklahoma and did her master's in legal studies and Indigenous Peoples Law. So she's very much in that realm and has had work for tribes and some other things. And my other one's sort of floating out there. But just a funny story about identity and looks. So I actually grew up in Bethesda. Again, I'm a woman of a certain age. So this was all before civil rights. So people don't understand this part either, is that we were colored by Maryland law back then. So it wasn't black and white, drinking fountains. It was white and colored. And by law, we were colored. And if you can see, again, this is the South to me now, living in Vancouver, but we were quite dark in the summer running around. And so we had to go to the colored fountains. We couldn't be seen by the local doctor. There's a place here called Glen Echo back in the day. Everybody wanted to go to Glen Echo. We weren't allowed, it was segregated. So all our friends would go there, we couldn't go. So we were having this whole experience that 98% of people in Bethesda weren't having, because it's a very white place. It still is a very white place. And again, nobody understood us. And, who are you? What are you? If I heard that once, I heard it a million times. And my father was a German blue-eyed, we couldn't have been more different. And I had a brother and sister, that they had a brother and sister and then adopted the 3 of us. And my brother had blue eyes, we didn't look, we stuck out like sore thumbs. I don't know what to tell you. And so then you start harboring that stuff. And they remembered their families, sort of, even though they were still little. So I'll tell you a little story about the brother I was adopted with. So he was, Melvin Nathan Little Owl was his name. He was probably the older of us, 4 or 5 at adoption. And he was one of 8, or those 2 were the last of 8. So he had brothers and sisters, he had a name, he was living there, he was running around, whatever, and they got taken away. I think if I hear my mother, who I grew up with, it was for cause. If I hear, because I've since met a lot of people, they say it wasn't. I don't know. In Canada, they call it the 60s scoop. where they just came and took people, make them good white people. That's, again, getting rid of that Indian problem. So I grew up under the get rid of the Indian problem, the reservation era, the relocation era, assimilation. And so it does different things to you. That's why I'm for the ICWA, even though I was pre-ICWA and adopted. I have no ill will against my family in any way, shape, or form, but it didn't work. So that brother who was running around on the reservation suddenly was in Washington, D.C. area in a suit named James Philip Hankey. That's a huge, you can't find a bigger change than something like that. And then he often had a lot of problems, drinking, alcohol, drugs, etc., total confusion about things. And then he transitioned before people talked about transitioning and started living his life as a woman named Carmen. And he moved to San Francisco, and unfortunately was like one of the first crowd to die in the AIDS crisis. So I write a little bit about him, saying he was a two-spirit. Two-spirit isn't just I'm gay, it's they have a role. And his role was to let people know what it was like to be, Nathan Little Owl, James Phillip, and Carmen in this assimilation swirling mess. And I mean, you could unpack him for days. And then my sister didn't make it either. He died at like 34. She died by 50 with alcohol. And again, all these problems, if you were colored and grew up in Bethesda in the 60s, trust me, it was no picnic. And so they never fit in. And so people ask me, how did you do all this? How did you do all this? I'm like, looking back now, knowing what I know, I think it was a trauma response. I'm like running as fast as I can, trying to not die. And then as you saw that picture, I met my mother after college. I literally, the day after I walked on the stage, I got in my car and I drove to North Dakota from Washington State. And I met them. And my mother cried every time I came anywhere near her. That's that historical trauma. So I kept trying to assure her, well, I had a good life, I had a good life, but obviously there were the issues that I've talked about. So anyway, so I have an understanding of all how these laws hit people, whether you were on the reservation the whole time, whether you were like me and taken away and have to figure it out. And I think what helped me is I did go back, whereas my brother and sister were just trying to make it and cope as they could, and it just didn't work. And then that brother I showed you also died at like 34 in a vehicle accident. Again, we hit some of the major reasons that I showed you that people die on there. Alcohol, AIDS wasn't on there, but it was also drugs and alcohol with him, and vehicle accident. So of the four of us, our average life expectancy is like 45. So it's whether you're on reservation or off reservation. So I'm like, I hit 50. I'm like, thank God, let me just get out of this 50th year, and I'll be the only one that did. So that's always swirling in your head as well. All this stuff is swirling in your head, and then you're trying to, make sense of it, I guess.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Morse, for this presentation. My name is Edward Oladipo from New Jersey. So, I don't know where to start. It's like listening and, hearing all this is a little bit kind of overwhelming for me. When I try to relate those information you have given and try to think back a little bit. I was talking to a colleague yesterday when we went to the museum, and as soon as I entered the gallery, one of the gallery, I just get upset. I became upset right away because when I saw those materials, those artifacts that was taken away from Africa, and I begin to connect. My father was a traditionalist. So he was able to let us see the importance of culture, and that everywhere you go, you need to carry this with you because this is your identity, this is who you are, and this is how people will be able to see you, that this is where you belong and this is how you have been raised. So when I look at those artifacts, it clicked right in my head that this is what made my community, this is what made my people who they are, and those thoughts were forcefully taken away. I put it in a code. I said those artifacts were stolen materials. You took the people and you take what actually I refer to as their identity, you take it away from them. So even if the people cannot return back to their original source, whatever that's supposed to be remain in that community for their great-grandchildren to be able to identify themselves as this is who we are, you take those things along with you. There's one particular artifact that stood out yesterday, and that was an original crown of a king in Ijebu land. And that is what actually makes you a king. When a king passes and then they selected a new king and they start all the rituals, it takes like days, sometimes 21 days, sometimes 41 days. And the height of the ritual that make you the king actually is a crown. And that will be the last, and then will say, this is what make you the king. And that's when people accept that now we have a new king. And you get to the museum and you see that identity that made that community sitting in the mall. So my question is this: the Native Americans, and with what you have seen and the experience you have had, how does the slave trade, bringing people mostly from Africa, how does it affect? Is there any area where they are interconnected? Because up to today, we are still seeing the effect of the slave trade in the Black community. A lot of people could not get half of that, plus everything that has happened and the limitation that have been set, maybe psychologically, physically, in terms of acquiring wealth, going back to school, getting educations, and all these laws that they have propagated lately, separation of families, when some crime, quoted, committed in the Black community, you go to jail. But when it's not a Black person or not a minority, you go to mental health hospital. So people are being treated based on their color with two different standards. They find a marijuana on you, it's a crime, you go to jail. But they find it on somebody that is not a person of color, no, this is a disease, he gets to be treated, he goes to the mental health hospital. So is there an interconnection? Because what I understand is the native were able to continue to stand their ground because most of them didn't move away from where they are. But for the Africans, they took them all far away from their base. So they didn't even have a chance to even go back if I thought they wanted to. So is there any point where there is an interconnection between the slave that was brought over here from Africa with the natives?
I don't think there's a huge one because, as I was saying, especially in the South, they moved American Indians off to bring in slaves and take the land to start farming and whatnot. But there were certainly individual connections. And as they moved the Indians to Oklahoma, especially with the Cherokee, there were, what were they called? Something men. There were Blacks who were allowed to become members of that tribe. Freedmen, is that what it's called? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? So anyway, that was an actual thing, and they were actually allowed to be members of Cherokee. I know there's some legal hassles about that right now. Some people want them out, some people say no, they're members, and so there's a bunch of stuff going on there. For myself, you saw the picture of my birth mother. She was quite dark, and so I learned after I met her that it says in these papers I have the slave from the South went up to Canada and married her grandmother. And so even there are some connections like that, but they're mostly individual versus community.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well-
Maybe you have community, other rooms.
Oh, yeah.
Well, thank you.
Mhm.
We actually have to wrap up. Is that okay?